name is Gelmi. I've been working with leaders across the globe, across cultures and organizations for almost 20 years now, supporting them in developing their personal and interpersonal skills and in reaching personal breakthroughs, not just as leaders, but as human beings. And much of my work has to do with raising awareness, with developing more consciousness as a leader. So let's see what it means to be a conscious leader. We live in a VUCA world. VUCA representing the four main challenges that leaders have to face nowadays. V standing for volatility, which means an increasing speed of change in almost all markets and businesses. U for uncertainty, or the increasing lack of orientation that we experience. C for complexity in almost all areas of life. And A for ambiguity, where there is no more right or wrong necessarily, no more black or white, but rather shades of gray. And this can be quite a challenging environment to navigate, especially for leaders in organizations. Some are coping quite well, are developing resilience, agility, and consciousness, and others have more difficulties. It's a spectrum. At the other far end of the spectrum, we find individuals who are or find themselves being in the reactive mode most of the time, being unconscious and rigid, and therefore developing symptoms. Some of them experiencing depression, others ending up in burnout, and others again experience social isolation. None of which is healthy, of course. So apart from being more effective as a leader when developing consciousness, it is also a very important aspect of stress management and staying mentally healthy as a leader. Because who you are and the energy you radiate as a leader is of utmost importance. Albert Schweitzer once said, "Leading by example is not the best way to lead. It's the only one." So where you are, in what place you are, in what kind of balance or what quality of balance you find yourself is really of utmost importance. Therefore, self-care and self-empathy as a leader are at the heart of my work. Now, much of these difficulties and challenges are due to the nature of our mind, which can be compared to an augmented reality device. Those devices that add an additional layer of information between us and the reality we perceive. The mind works just like that. It has a strong tendency to judge and label what we experience. It adds this additional layer of stories we are telling ourselves about what's happening and what we are experiencing. And this, of course, can also lead to a distorted and biased perception of reality. And much of the noise our mind is producing has a tendency towards the negative, has a tendency to be future-oriented or oriented to the past, and therefore not being fully present in the here and now, not being conscious. Now, if we look at what drives our behavior, we could say we have an iceberg situation where the visible behavior or the conscious behavior is only the tip, the visible tip, the obvious. And by behavior, I mean our decisions, our actions, the things we say or don't say, the things we do or don't do. Now, much of this behavior is driven by aspects that we are often not so conscious of. Below the waterline here, so to speak. We can distinguish between short-term and long-term influencing factors on our behavior. Among the short-term influences being our inner reactions, the inner spontaneous reactions to what we're experiencing, our thinking, the conceptual thoughts and stories we are telling ourselves in our mind, and our emotions, how we feel about something or someone, or even ourselves. And because this can be quite volatile and quickly change throughout the day, I also refer to it sometimes as the inner weather conditions, ever changing like the weather outside. Sometimes it's sunny, then the wind comes up, developing into a storm, rain and thunder before the sun comes out again. Long-term influencing factors are values, our value system, values like respect, honesty, loyalty, and many others, individually different from person to person. Based on these values, we carry beliefs, the truths we carry in ourselves through which we look at the world, our entire life's experiences, and our needs. Among the most important needs are the need for feeling competent and valued, the need for autonomy, and the need for relatedness or bonding, being connected with other human beings, being in relationship, being part of a group, a family, a team, an organization. Now, all of these things not only influence, but also drive our behavior. But because we are often not so much aware of them, we tend to be on autopilot mode. And a majority of our moment-by-moment decisions, for example, that we make throughout the day are made unconsciously and based on our inner emotional state. So, becoming more conscious and becoming more self-aware or also more mindful means to lower the waterline so that more of this lower part of the iceberg becomes visible to us, becomes apparent, so that we can deactivate the autopilot and be in the driver's seat. Because only what we're aware of, we can control. What we're not aware of controls us. So the question is really, am I aware enough? Am I mindful enough and in connection with myself so that I notice my inner weather conditions and how they change during a meeting, for example? Do I notice at an early stage that anger is about to build up, like a cloud in a blue sky? Or am I just as much aware that I only noticed that I got angry after I exploded and caused collateral damage on relationships? So this is one part of being a conscious leader, being more conscious of ourselves. Also in an intellectual sense, exploring our own value and belief system. That's some intellectual work to be done there, besides being more mindful and self-aware. Now, how is this relevant in leadership when it's about interacting with others and influencing others, mobilizing others to do what needs to be done? Which brings me to one of my favorite definitions of leadership by Dwight Eisenhower. Now, you may think, oh, Eisenhower, that's old stuff, that's outdated. Well, his definition of leadership was that leadership is the art of making someone do what needs to be done because they want to do it. So, in my humble opinion, this definition is very timely and is very relevant nowadays, especially the last part of the sentence. I don't want people to do what needs to be done because they have to, or because they run into problems and sanctions if they don't. So they do it to avoid problems. When we used to need people who did what we told them, today and in the future, we need people who do what they're not told to do because they think for themselves. They feel empowered. They take ownership. And they do what needs to be done because they want to do it and because they see the contribution they make to the bigger and higher good. Now, what happens when two icebergs meet? Let's say in a one-on-one meeting between a leader and a team member. This interaction happens very obviously above the waterline on the factual level. The level of information sharing, of agenda points, tasks, and responsibilities. And that's usually also the aspect of the interaction that we focus on, especially in the business, because this is serious. So it's about facts and figures, which is okay if the lower part of the iceberg is not neglected, or as long as the lower part of the iceberg is not ignored, which is the relational level of the interaction. Anything that happens on the level of relationship and emotions. How do people feel in this meeting? What's the emotional climate? Is it a climate of potential threat? Or is it a safe climate of trust, where everybody feels safe enough to say and admit that they may have done something wrong or that they don't know what to do next? And it's fine, it's okay. We're here to help and support each other. So what's the emotional atmosphere you create as a leader? And why is this important? You see, if you imagine a real iceberg floating in the ocean, they are not static. They float around, they change direction. Now, what would you say is the main influencing factor that moves the iceberg? Is it the winds blowing against the tip? Or is it the currents below the waterline? Well, on a stormy day, it's probably both, and the wind has its share in moving the iceberg. But generally speaking, it's the currents. It's the currents below the surface that mobilize the iceberg. Now, you can take this image and transfer it into real life in any situation where it's about influencing others, which is, of course, the case in leadership, but also in sales or in teamwork and collaboration. Whenever you need to have influence on others because you want to sell an idea or a project or make someone make a decision or calm down a situation, de-escalate a conflict, the music plays on the relationship level, much more than on the factual level. And I'm sure you all have experienced situations when somebody wanted to convince you of something, but you already decided that it's not going to happen, not with you. And you closed the door on the relationship. Now, in such a situation, when there is no solid and stable open door connection on the relationship, it will be increasingly difficult, if not impossible, to convince you with rational facts and figures. So, again, it's about becoming more conscious and not just focusing on the level of rational and factual interaction, but to open up and widen the awareness to the entire situation and everything that's happening. Because especially when there are irritations building up on the relationship level, when somebody in a meeting feels disrespected, for example, or even offended by a remark somebody made, or they don't feel safe, they don't feel heard, and they are not in a good emotional state, but rather in distress, it will make the whole progress of this meeting on the factual level very, very difficult. So here as well, it's about lowering the waterline, paying more attention to what's happening, especially to potential irritations, which very often we get clues about. Body language, for example. I mean, rolling the eyes is already very obvious, but if somebody avoids eye contact, for example, or is just less engaged in a discussion than usual, these are clues. And when we notice something like this, we as leaders, we can make it transparent by creating a space and offering the possibility to address it. By asking, for example, what's on your mind, Paul, so far in the discussion? What are your thoughts? Or if you don't want to be addressing the person directly, you just, if it's a meeting with multiple attendees, you ask the question to the group. What are your thoughts about what we have just discussed? Where do you stand currently? Let's do a little temperature check. Giving the opportunity to bring it up and to put it on the table. Because, again, only what we're aware of we can control, we can work with, we can do something about. What we are not aware of, what we're not conscious of, controls us or the situation. The famous elephant in the room. It's there, it has a massive influence on the quality of the interaction, but it's not transparent and it's not being addressed. So, if there are two forms of intelligence, there are more, of course, but the two mostly known forms of intelligence, intellectual intelligence, IQ, the intelligence of the brain, and the intelligence of the heart, EQ, or emotional intelligence. They don't compete. They're both important, of course, but they need to be combined. As leaders, we need to show up with our hearts and minds in order to truly and authentically connect with others and build relationship. What makes this a bit more challenging is a certain bias we have in our perception, and that's the so-called negative bias. Or in simple words, one falling tree makes more noise than a whole growing forest. What does that mean? If you have a typical work day and 10 things on your to-do list go well, and you can tick them off, but one thing goes wrong, what are you thinking about in the evening when you're trying to fall asleep. Probably not the 10 things you did well, but rather the one falling tree. And that's a very natural bias we have. It is very old. It has to do with survival. It kept our ancestors who went out hunting every day from being killed by wild animals. It was much more important to focus on potential threats rather than on the fact that there's a blue sky and the sun is shining. Who cares? Now, even though this is a natural bias, it is a bias. And it keeps us from having a realistic view of things, of our days, of the performance of our team members, for example. Now, the good news is awareness or attention is like a flashlight, like a torch. What you shine the light on, you see better. Where you put the light is what you perceive. That's what exists. What you put in front of you is what exists for you. Now, one thing you can do with a flashlight is you can change the focus. You can decide what to focus on. Another thing is that, those flashlights where you can turn the lens in the front and the beam gets more narrow or wider. You can make a conscious decision to consciously expand your awareness and your focus of attention so that you also see the growing forest and not just the falling trees, not just the problems. And in leadership, the challenge with this bias is that when a leader walks through the organization with this negative bias in place, what does he or she mostly see? Problems, difficulties, anything that's not the way it's supposed to be. And what does this leader then give feedback about? Well, of course, anything that's not going well, resulting in negative feedback or critical feedback. And that's the reason why I often hear from employees in organizations that, I always just hear from my boss when something goes wrong. When everything goes right and I do my work well, I don't hear anything. That's the reason. The reason is this negative bias. It's not bad intentions. So for you as a leader, if you want to be even more effective than you already are, and you want to leverage on increasing consciousness, the principles I've been talking about so far, make a conscious decision every day to also focus on what's going well, to spot what employees in your team are doing well, and then tell them. Let them know, hey, Gary, I saw the extra mile you went yesterday. I saw it and I was so proud to see that. So thank you. Thank you for that. You cannot just make somebody's day like that, but you can change somebody's entire perception of their work and their contribution to the organization's purpose. But because it goes a bit against our nature, it takes a conscious decision on a daily basis first, until you have built a habit, until you have conditioned yourself to be more realistic in your perception and see the falling trees and the growing forest too. And by all means, if there is a problem, there are falling trees, resolve those problems. Don't focus only on what's going well. You may end up with the falling trees falling on your head. And that's, of course, not what we want. So I'd like to end with a quote by the famous Indian speaker and writer Jiddu Krishnamurti, who, when asked what his secret is, he said very simply, "My secret is I don't mind what happens," which is another way of describing radical acceptance of what is and of what cannot be changed. And in any situation, in any given situation, problem, or challenge we have, there are always those aspects we cannot change or control. And there are always the things we can change and control. The question is, what do we focus on? Do we focus on what we cannot change and what we think should be different, and we're angry about it or frustrated and are stuck in resistance against what we cannot change, which is a complete waste of time and energy? Or do we recognize what cannot be changed and redirect our focus of attention fully on what we can do? What we focus on, the meaning we give to it with our augmented reality mind, and how we respond to it. By raising this level of mindfulness and consciousness, we become more human as leaders, connecting, truly connecting with others, building relationships, and maintaining them also under difficult conditions when the road gets bumpy every now and then. Because no matter whether you are in the B2B business or in the B2C business, it's always H to H, human to human. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this was useful and that you got some impulses for yourself to take away and apply in your work as a leader. Feel free to reach out to me if you like on LinkedIn, Facebook, through my website. I'd be happy to hear from you. And for now, I wish you well, and I hope you become the conscious leader you always wanted to have.